Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where we talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and/or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Nancy Drew. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. We have Nancy, George, and Ace heading to Detective Con, and they left Nick and Bess behind because, well, it turns out, Nick's dealing with everything with the youth center, so George's like, yeah, he's stressing out, so I need to get away from him. And they left Bess behind. At first, it's kind of like, Nick is like, oh, you're being crazy that they didn't ditch us. But then she finds out later on, Ace kind of purposely didn't bring her along because she's been mothering him lately. And it's like, it's so interesting that she's kind of playing that role. And he's like, and she's like, wait, mothering? And it's like, because of the whole Mr. Bobbsey situation. It's like, I kicked him out of my car. She's like, yeah, and you really think that's going to be the end of it? It's kind of what she was getting. So I guess Ace must have confided in her, and probably only her, about like what happened when he ran into Mr. Bobbsey in the last episode. So I guess that's probably what that's correlating to. So, and I find it fascinating that he only is telling, because Bess is the only one that knows about all that he's up to. Granted, they still haven't found the connections to other stuff that Ace was a part of that's been helping. I mean, it'll probably come up later on when like a lot of that box stuff that he was helping deliver comes back, and it's like, oh, you're the analog person who helped out, so that's going to probably come up sooner or later. But regardless, this is all about Lacey helping them find FHK, the Frozen Heart Killer, and she knows his identity and stuff like that. But when you claim to have solved so many cases over and over again, the police stop listening to you, so they're not willing to listen to whatever evidence she has now. So she wants a particular old case, Joe Kelsey. I guess Nancy never really found out initially why. And so looking into the case, she wanted to find out, well, why? Like, why this particular case? And it's about a guy, who was accused of like a murder and even executed. But on the way there, the car starts shutting down. Florence starts shutting down, and it turns out this is all Joe's thing. And I love that George is like, I told you not to open the box, because his spirit is there. And so they get locked into the factory where he ends up spreading all the evidence around, and he's recreating the scene for them. But Nancy's like, that doesn't fit because he's left-handed, but like the fact is the crime was, if you look at the evidence, it seems like it's being done by someone who's right-handed, so why is he lying? And I assumed, my initial figured is like, yeah, Joe's protecting someone. I just assumed like whoever committed the murder, he was trying to actually protect him. Turns out that's not the case, but we'll get to that soon enough. So the only way to help out with this whole situation was to burn the evidence, which obviously Nancy, being who she is, because, she's like, right, it's very dishonest us to give Lacey fake evidence, but obviously Joe's not going to let us go, and Joe doesn't want this crime actually solved, so we'll have to burn it all. But Ace kept the matchbook. We never found out actually why. And I guess just in general, like hearing his case, especially because he talks about it later on, that he had a connection with Joe because Joe had numbers on his arm. It's like, right. He's like, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. So it's like, he just wants to know, like, why a Holocaust survivor would throw away everything. Like, here in America, you surviving what you survived, like, why would they, like, confess to a crime they potentially didn't commit? Like, what was up with, like, why would he do that? And so Ace had a connection with him. That's why he couldn't fully let it go. He had to understand, like, why. Obviously, later on, kind of getting possessed or at least affected by Joe's spirit. Which, being at Detective Con, some interesting things. One, I guess I didn't recognize it by the picture or her voice, but the actress who plays Lacey is the actress who plays Ruby on Charmed. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, but it's like, yeah, this is probably like a one-episode thing, so we might hear more from Lacey going forward, but it probably won't be like any on-screen appearances necessarily, so maybe that's how she, like, because I don't know if Charmed is filming or still filming currently. I don't look into like the production sides of things unless like it comes up in news, like I actively go looking for it, which I typically don't. So I don't know where the production schedule is, but it's just one of those things of like, hey, I reckon, like, I just love I don't know whether it's just a casting situation with a lot of CW stuff. Is it just kind of like, oh, you're over here on this lot, why don't you just slide over here to where we're working on this other show kind of at a similar time? Like, I don't know how that whole thing works, because it's just, you see a lot of familiar faces amongst the shows. I always just think that's always the dopest and interesting thing. But Yeah, I love that it is Detective Con, and it's just kind of like, I even love George being like, shouldn't you be bigger here? When she was talking to Nancy, and Nancy's like, I guess I'm just kind of like the East, I'm just a coastal person, which is like, it's funny, because I'm sure a lot of those are like fictitious detectives at Detective Con, and it's like, yeah, which is supposed to be like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because, yeah, which is, it's super meta, considering Nancy is a literary, like a well-known enough literary detective. I've never read any of the books, but I know of Nancy Drew just because of like different adaptations that's happened. But also like her name gets used as like a colloquialism of kind of like, oh, you're going like full blown Nancy Drew here. Like it means like, oh, you're looking into something like fervently, I guess would kind of always been my interpretation of it. But it gets used in that regard too. So like you always associate Nancy Drew with the so it's super meta that there's like a Detective Con. It'd be like there being a Detective Con in elementary, and it's just, I mean, Sherlock is he's known enough in certain regard, but he's not like it's not like he's a literary status like in the show Elementary or even Sherlock to be that, so it's one of those meta things of having like, oh, here's these other fictitious, but it's like you're real in your world, so I always think that's such a fascinating like meta thing. But also we found out, because initially someone walks up to George and I'm like, oh, cool costume, and she's almost like, what? It turns out George is in fact the one that's super famous at Detective Con. There are George fans, and I love that. And she's like, I'm not a fan, I'm the fan. It's like, who's writing a story about me? Because talking about her experience about dying and coming back to life and stuff like solving things with her like plucky sidekick Nancy Drew. I'm like, I love that Nancy's the sidekick. But I figured I was like, right, whoever's writing the story has to be someone that's close enough to George to know that, and to put her in the role of the main character has to be someone that really cares about her. So I was like, well, we saw Ted earlier in the episode, so I was like, it's her, isn't it? I was like, man, like all her siblings are up to something. We spent a little bit more time with Jesse last season, but it's just like, first you got Charlie last episode stealing the engagement ring. Now you've got Ted, like, got a membership and she's selling merch. I love it. It's just like, George is kind of like, and then people are asking for for her to sign something. It's like so overwhelming, and that's supposed to be the meta joke of it at all. Instead of it actually being Nancy, it's George that's the famous one. So I love it. But also, like, Nancy loves what she does, but she also kind of doesn't want the recognition for it. It's just kind of like, nah. Together, her and Lacey laid the trap to catch the real Frozen Heart killer, because he reached out to Lacey because it's like he likes hearing people talk him up. And that's what he's doing. Like everything at least it seems like everything he does is because he wants to be known. He wants to be investigated. It's like that narcissism of just like, oh, I want to be but he's saying like there's more to it than that when they actually meet him. Cause like his real name's like Roderick. And when you actually do meet him later on, which I love, I figured they would do this. It's a weird reference to make. I forgot. It's one of the Scooby-Doo movies, I believe. The Scooby Gang goes on like a mystery like ship, and it's like it kind of sucks because they immediately solve everything. It's like they do it for a living, so like everyone on I think it was a pirate movie if I remember correctly, and everyone else is pissed at them because it's like they ruined everything. It's like, well, we're really good at solving mysteries, so like they just superstars on the ship, and a lot of the attendees and everyone like hates them. It made me think of that. It's like, yeah, you're real, like, you guys solve crimes. So they accidentally, I thought it was going to be a bigger thing where they accidentally just like, oh, we figured out who the person is. Cause like there's this background thing about like, oh yeah, there's this evil social worker you're supposed to be finding, and they found him because they were looking for Roderick. They found it, and they got like a coupon to like some places fish and chips, and it's like, oh, cool. I just love that. It's a couple lines of dialogue, and it just kind of becomes a throwaway thing at the end because it's like, oh, you caught me, and it's like, right, whatever. And I love that he goes for a high five from like Bess and Nick, and he goes to George, and George is like, no, get away from me. It doesn't say that, but I love the George energy. I just like how she gets like, just like George gets fed up with people like, no, I'm not a sociable person, to like, get away. But yeah, they caught Roderick, and I thought it was interesting, like, if you saw when he turned his head, he had a tuft of white in the back of his head. I was like, is that something, or is that just, it seems like such a small detail. It's like the rest of his hair was, like, not unless that was just something from the actor, but it was like, that seemed like very specific. So I'm like, he says that he's part of something bigger. So, because it's like, right, what did you do with, like, because also we never found out, like, why he chose Nancy, why he chose people chose killing a guy that was connected to Nancy. So it's like, it seems like this might be connected to Temperance in some shape or form. Like what Temperance is up to, like maybe she was able to convince the Frozen Heart killer to start doing what he did. Because he did start kill. Like she tried to be like, oh, I have nothing to do with this. But it just so happens this happens around the time that she came into Horseshoe Bay and everything. So it's like, not less her tearing down the barrier, once again, attracted other things. The Horseshoe Bay and stuff is happening that she's taking advantage of, but she's not directly involved in. That's what I'm like, I don't know. There's definitely something there, considering he said, like, oh, I'm part of something bigger. So part of me is like, is he not the only Frozen Hearts killer? Like, is there other people too? Is it not just like a one person? Because he seems like fairly young. I would expect it, the killer, to be someone seemed like they'd be older. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong. But that's why I'm like, could it be like a serial killer spirit connecting to like are we gonna find out there's multiple Frozen Heart killers, or is it just like, oh, I've been doing all of this? Like, are these regular people? Because I was about to say, like, did he get supernatural powers? But it's like, no, he's not using like supernatural abilities to freeze people's heart. There's a scientific, like, there's an actual process that he's actually doing to freeze people's hearts. So, because Lacey's the one that kind of figured out a lot of the stuff, especially because, like, back then, like, she didn't expect, like, it's like she's the one that figured out, like, oh, he stopped killing for 3 years because he froze off 2 of his own fingers in the process, which I love that they, like, Nancy was tearing into him, like, kind of a bit of a loser if you can't even, like, oh, like, every time you're trying to kill somebody, you end up freezing off one of your fingers. Pretty lame, kind of a loser. So, but I also love the thing of just, like, it's a very meta thing, because it's also a very podcast thing of, like, cool, we'll talk about that more after a word from our sponsors. It's like, oh, yeah, just, I don't know, I was like, oh, yeah, like, that's a very, like, real podcast thing to do. I think it's interesting to do that, like, I mean, I've never actually I've seen a few live podcasts at conventions, but I've never, like, not live, but, like, it was recorded afterwards, but I'm like, I don't know, like, I would assume they don't do that typically, like, have live sponsorships like that. I mean, maybe that is a thing, maybe it just depends on the con or whatever. I've never actually been to a convention myself. I should know that. I don't know, I'm also not very in a crowd, so I think conventions would be my mega super ultra kryptonite, because I'm not big. There's plenty of stuff, places I want to go, like, it'd be interesting going to, like, a Comic-Con or something like that, but, like, that many people, I'm also, like, not big into spending large chunks of money, too. I'm, like, I don't have that, like, cash on, like, reserve like that, so, like, I think that kind of plays a role in it, but tangents and all that aside. But yeah, it's just a lot of interesting developments in this episode, aside from all that. I mean, they were, concluding the Joe situation. Like, the fact is that Ace happened to sit beside her. That's why I was like, oh, did she, that lady is like, did she commit the crime? And, is she the one that committed the crime and Joe was covering for her or something like that? It's like, no, her and Joe were in a relationship, because obviously the lady he ended up having to sit beside happened to be Lacey's grandmother, and that's why she took an interest in, because she wanted to kind of give her grandma some closure, because she knew some of the story. But it turns out they were in a relationship, even though he was kind of immigrant. The fact is, it was still a white man dating a black woman, and no matter what, she would have been the one in trouble. So he took the fall for the crime, because she tried to claim he was innocent, but he confessed, because it would have been admitting that they were having an affair. They were having a relationship at the hotel, and considering time and everything, they wouldn't have been. It would have all felt bad on. It would have fell back on her, So she would have been the one that got in trouble. So Joe confessed to the crime, even though he didn't do it. And the sad thing is, the guard that was the other watchman that turns out to be the one behind, I was almost like, oh, tell me that bastard didn't get free. It's like, no, well, he did eventually get caught, because he tried it it was some years later. Doesn't make it any better, but at least, like, yeah, that bastard got his comeuppance. It still sucks that Joe did what he did, but he also did what he did because it was that time, because of the times, he tried to protect the person he cared about. Even for his own sake, he wasn't going to let, Lacey's grandma, like, throw her life away. Granted, she wasn't a grandma at that time, but still. And, but because of him, because of his sacrifice, she was able to lead a full life. And obviously Joe is able to, like, that's why his soul wasn't at rest this entire time, because he wanted to make sure she was okay. And finally, he could hear from her, like, she's okay. My sacrifice was worth it, So he just wanted to keep that secret the entire time. But now it's a point in time where it's okay for the truth to be out there. Granted, the evidence is gone now, so only they will ever know the truth, so it's not something like, that will ever get out. And and for Joe, I'm sure, like, for him, it doesn't matter, it doesn't change anything. Knowing she was okay, knowing she got to live her life is all he cared about. Knowing all he wanted to do was protect her, so he got to pass on. So I thought that was beautiful. But like I think I was talking about it earlier, like, Nancy isn't big into recognition and stuff like that. So Lacey's getting a lot of attention for the Frozen Heart Killer thing, but she was kind of like, "No, I'm good." So we also found out, like I was bringing up earlier, yeah, it was Ted behind everything. But she's like, "Oh, like I am, like, there's a lot of money she's getting and stuff like that." And I love, because like George is like, "Well, sign me up." She's like, "Cool, that'll be $10 for a membership." And she's like, "What?" It's like, "Look at all this money." It's like, well, I mean, you're still grounded in everything, and don't let this affect your schoolwork, but how can I just stomp your entrepreneurial spirit? So it's like, I can't. So we also have Bess, who's like obviously interning a little bit while Hannah's away, and ended up running into one of her previous situations. We'll kind of leave it at that. Ended up being Addie, and it's like, oh, cool, I'm here for something. And it turns out she was getting that something for Nick. And it's like, oh, cool. So it's like, oh, hope and we never see each other again. Like, hard cut to a couple scenes later. Oh, cool. I guess we're going to be seeing a lot more of each other. But it's because she thought, like, Bess was kind of shallow. But like, Bess is like, the fact is, I have so many other, like, she just kind of wanted there to be kind of like a, hey, let's, physicality, like an in-depth conversation isn't something she was really looking for. Which even Adam's like, dude, if I knew you were interesting like this, I would have we could have like banged it out essentially. So they do their thing. So I think because Bess, already lost her soulmate. So I think for her, with the Odette situation, which, speaking of, that's how Ted knows all the details. Apparently, like, she heard it all from Odette, and that's why she was able to write. Because it's like, yeah, I figured it had to be someone close to her. It's like, right, didn't realize it was going to be someone that close to her that was basically spilled the beans. But it's also because, like, Ted's like, yeah, like, it's like, oh, are you doing this because you're proud of me? Ted's like, I guess. And it's like, oh. But also, she's profiting off your adventure, yours and the crew's, like, adventure in solving crimes, and just also your story, too. She's making a pretty penny. I wonder where that money's going to go. I guess maybe to some college fund or something, like, or, But it's like, it's a side business, it's a job, so you can keep doing it just as long as it doesn't interfere with your schoolwork. So just George being like the mother figure that she always kind of has been for her siblings. But obviously, like I was talking about earlier, there definitely, as Roderick made it clear, there is definitely a lot more going on with this. And even Nancy's like, do you ever get that feeling where, like, it just seems like a case isn't quite solved? So there's still a lot more at play with this. We'll ultimately have to wait and see where the next episode ends up taking us going forward with all of this. There were little winks and nods to, like, Ace and Nancy, just because of, like, kind of the awkward moments they had, like when him and George pulled her over the railing, and it was like pulled her when she almost fell, and like she was on top of him for a second, and just them in the car together. It's like, yeah, it's there. You can cut that tension with a knife. And even though for a moment you can tell, like, George is kind of like, I wonder, has she picked up on it and she's just not saying anything, or she just being like, why is there kind of an awkward error? Like, I'm curious, but it's definitely gonna be interesting to see those developments. I should also point out, someone did say a little while back they wish that Nancy and Nick would get back together because they like that. But I'm like, honestly, I've always really liked it. Like I brought it up, like, maybe season 1, but definitely season 2. Like, I always felt like I think Ace and Nancy would be good together, but I also think, like, George and Nick make a really, like, nice couple just because of just, like, their personalities and just who they are as people. Like, I actually like George and Nick as a couple. But I mean, everyone's, got their, like, their particular, like, couplings and stuff like that. But it's like, I like the couplings being what they are, at least what they're kind of setting out, the potential Ace and Nancy thing. Now, whether that ends up working out or not, who knows? We'll see. But I've had that in the back of my mind for a while. I just kept forgetting to bring it up during one of these reviews. But nevertheless, I just thought that just kind of wanted to add that in there at the end. But like I said, we'll have to wait and see where everything ends up taking us going forward to the next episode. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.